So I'm a big football fan, and I've been following the Minnesota Vikings from early childhood. And I was raised mostly in Minnesota, so I've been kind of a Minnesota sports person in general, so I'm here for your sympathy. When I was a kid and played Little League, the Minnesota Twins won the World Series in '87 and again in '91. It was awesome. And that's the last time. The Minnesota Vikings went to 4 Super Bowls, 3 of them before I was born, 1 when I was 2, and they lost all 4. The hockey team, the Wild, have never been to the Stanley Cup. The Minnesota Timberwolves, the NBA team, has never made it to the NBA finals. The Minnesota Lynx, the WNBA team, has won the championship. Last time was 6 or 7 years ago, but that was, I don't know if you remember, nobody watched WNBA 7 years ago. So that all happened before we even really knew it was a sport. So, like I said, it's true. You go back pre-Caitlin Clark days, how many of you guys were avid WNBA fans? Just wasn't the thing yet. But I'm mostly a football fan. That's what I watch the most. That's what keeps me up at night. Like if it's a late game, there's times where if we're playing one of the late games, LaVon is in bed and she's like, "Are you coming to bed?" I'm like, "It's almost over. You got to wait." And so anyway, I'm a football fan, and yesterday the first Vikings preseason game happened, and I watched part of that. And one of the interesting things is this year they're doing the kickoffs differently, and I don't quite understand all the rules yet. When you start watching, you're going to shake your head and be like, "What is this?" So the NFL is constantly trying to make the game safer. They're wanting to cut down, player injuries, which I understand. I disagree with most of what the league does. It's not that I'm pro-player injury, but it is a contact sport, and I like to keep it that way. If they were only getting paid minimum wage, I'd be like, sure. But you got to understand, these players are making, some of them, their game check is more than you will make in a decade. So if they happen to tear their knee out, I'm okay with that. I don't want it to be my players, which it was last year and this year in training camp. But I know what that's like. I've torn my ACL, I'd survived, and nobody was paying me for it. So the league is constantly trying to make the game safer. Now imagine, if you will, if the league was trying to make the game more brutal. If the league was like, you know what? We want our players to just man up and play. We're eliminating the helmets. There is no defenseless receiver rules. That you can hit the quarterbacks low, you can kneecap them if you want to. Like, we're going to make the game more injury prone. We want the players out there to suffer and possibly die on the field. And you'd be like, "Oh, that sounds awful." Some of you are hesitant. You're like, "You know what? I'd still watch." Now, there was a time in history where there was a giant stadium where thousands upon thousands of people would go and show up and watch. And the point of the sport over time became more and more brutal. It became more and more of a blood sport. And more, the people who were forced to play died in front of the whole crowd, and the crowd cheered it on and wanted more. And I think you understand what I'm talking about, the gladiator games. Now, if you lived during that time, as a Christian, would you support the gladiator games knowing full well you're going to show up and watch people get murdered in front of you? Would you go to that? Would you pay the admission? Would you buy the Roman hot dog? And I don't know what they had there. I'm sure they had a hot dog cannon, right? They probably had a hot dog catapult. Would you show up for that? Or would your conscience say, you know what? I can't watch that. Now, you have to understand the gladiator games, as they progressed, because they lasted for between 400 and 500 years. They lasted for longer than America has been a country. And they got progressively more violent. Would you say as a follower of Jesus that you'd feel comfortable sponsoring those games? You know what? I'd like to support that sport. I'm going to buy season tickets. I want to sponsor a team, a gladiator. I want to be a part of this sport. Should Christians sponsor the execution of slaves and criminals for sport? And I think most of you would say, no, that's repulsive. Why would we? Of course wouldn't do that. That we've got a problem with that. What if I told you that the Christians who lived in Rome did that if they paid their taxes? Because the games were sponsored by Rome. The money brought into the empire paid for the games. A Roman statesman and an advisor to the Emperor Nero, his name is Lucius Seneca, which is a great Roman name. He wrote of the gladiator games to one of his younger friends. He said, "The other day I chanced to drop in at the midday games, excited, expecting sport and wit and some relaxation to rest men's eyes from the sight of human blood." See, he was thinking he was going to see more of an actual game, like football. Just the opposite was the case. Any fighting before, that was all as nothing. All trifles were now put aside. It was plain butchery. The men had nothing with which to protect themselves, for their whole bodies were open to the thrust. The common people prefer this to matches on level terms. The blade is not parried by helmet or shield, or what is the use of skill or defense? All these merely postpone death. In the morning, men are thrown to the bears or lions. At midday, to those who were previously watching, the crowd cries for the killers to be paired with those who will kill them and reserves the victor for yet another death. This is the only release the gladiators have. The whole business needs fire and steel to urge the men on to fight. There was no escape for them. The slayer was kept fighting until he could be slain. And so the Roman gladiator games became this brutal sport. They estimate that somewhere over possibly 400,000 people died at the Roman Colosseum in the gladiator games. Can you imagine that? 400,000 people. Some estimate it even higher than that. Thousands upon thousands of, and a lot of them were criminals and slaves and had no choice in the matter. So this is the context with which Paul is writing to the Christians in Rome. Nero, who is known as a vicious, brutal emperor, he is reigning during the time Paul writes the Roman Christians. And this is what he writes to them in Romans 13. Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God. And those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of the authorities? Do what is right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants sent for your good. But if you are doing wrong, of course, you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them, not only to avoid punishment, but also to keep a clear conscience. Pay your taxes too, for these same reasons. For government workers need to be paid. They are serving God in what they do. Give to everyone what you owe them. Pay your taxes and government fees to those who collect them, and give respect and honor to those who are in authority. And I got to tell you, if I was a Christian in Rome at this time, I'd be tempted to tell Paul, hey buddy, stay in your lane. Like, tell me stuff more about theology, but taxes? You're going to write to me about paying taxes? Paul, do you understand who Nero is? Do you understand what Rome does with their taxes? Have you been to the gladiator games? Do you see how the state is sponsoring the public execution of criminals and slaves? And Paul writes to those Christians and tells them, the government is the authority that God has placed over you. Pay your taxes. Respect the authority. They're servants of God. And it doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't seem right. But Paul knows some things about God that gives him a solid standing for saying what he said. See, God is sovereign. And what does sovereign mean? He's in control of everything. And the sovereign God is not limited by the darkness of man. See, the Roman Empire, Nero himself was no threat to the works of God. And so Paul can write to the Christians there and tell them, pay your taxes. Do what's right. The authorities were placed over you by God. They're his servants. And at face value, that seems so out of place. That seems like instead he should tell the Christians to rise up and revolt against an evil government. But he didn't. He told them to respect the government, even one ruled by Nero, who was a murderer, a butcher. But God is still sovereign. In the midst of the gladiator games, in the midst of the Roman Empire, at no point was the reign of Rome stronger than the reign of God. At no point was that empire more powerful than God. And the darkness of that empire was no threat to God. God is sovereign. In Revelation 21, it tells us that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He knows the end from the beginning. And the Roman Empire that Paul was writing to the Christians who are living there is just a blip on the timeline of God's rule and reign. In Colossians 1, it tells us that He created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see, like thrones and kingdoms and rulers and the authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through Him and for him. What does it mean? Created for him? Does that mean that the reign of Nero was created for God, that God was going to use that somehow? I mean, that's the context in which Paul is writing to the Roman Christians and to the Christians in Colossae when he wrote Colossians. In Psalm 103, it says, "The Lord has made the heavens his throne, and from there he rules over everything." Romans 11:33 says, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge, how impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his ways." And that speaks truth when you take it in context with what Paul would write a couple chapters later in 13, which we read. That God's ways and his wisdom are way above us. Matthew 10 says, "What is the price of 2 sparrows? 1 copper coin." Like, I'm sure you knew that. Everybody knows the price of a sparrow nowadays. And we do carry copper coins still, right? "But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows." And we read that and we think it's a little bit of hyperbole, right? With God, hyperbole is truth, not hype. With God, when he makes these grandiose statements like "I know every hair on your head," it sounds like it's just hyperbole. And we live in a culture, in a country where we can see hyperbole sometimes and people exaggerate their stories. But with God, it's not hype. It's truth. He knows every minute detail about you and your life, and he has your days mapped out. He has a perfect plan for your life, and it's going to have some winding roads, and it's going to have some ups and downs, but he knows it all. He's got it all mapped out. It's not hype. He knows you. He understands you. He knows what you're going through. He cares about what's happening in your life. You're more valuable to him than sparrows, and he takes care of them. He can take care of you. But then we got to ask ourselves, well, so if God is in control, if he is sovereign, if these things are true of him, then why does he let bad things happen? Why does he let difficult seasons to be a part of my life? Why does he let me hurt? Why does he allow the heartache? If God is in control, then why would he let the government do this? And why would he ask his followers to, through the means of taxes, support it? I have to tell you, I'm not a fan of taxes. When I say that, I can't say that strongly enough. I hate taxes. And my wife knows this about me, that so far it's an empty threat. But my empty threat is always, at some point, enough of us just have to stop paying taxes for them to listen to us. So long as we keep paying their salary, they're going to keep doing what they do. But if enough of us could stop paying taxes, they would finally listen and represent. Like I said, it's an empty threat, but it's a threat that I feel. See, when we bought our house when interest rates were decent, and we bought an inexpensive house. When we bought our house, it had you call that avocado green single-door refrigerator? Like, it was a house built in 1960, and in 1960 it was probably fabulous, but it still had the original curtains when we bought it. I'm certain of it. They left them up. How many of you guys, when you bought a house, you got curtains that were older than you? Anybody? Some people? See, the story of our house was built in 1960, and then it must have been the second owners lived there for 46 years until they had passed away or had moved in. One of them had passed away, one moved in. It was the house was being sold by the kids through the estate. And so the house had been in the same owners for all of those years. And they hadn't felt the need to remodel, ever, once. And if you know anything about the 60s, they loved their carpeted bathrooms. Nothing says musty like carpet in the bathroom. And so when we bought our house, good interest rate, wasn't too expensive. It was what I liked. I liked it. It's a solid built house. The floors are level. Like those are things, it's got good parking. But when I did my taxes this year, you know what I discovered? I pay more in taxes a month than my mortgage. And that hurts. To do your taxes and then look at what you pay during the course of the year and then realize, you know what? I pay more in taxes than my mortgage. So when I say I'm not a fan of taxes, you got to understand where that comes from. See, if you have children, you get some tax credits, and we don't, so we get no tax credits. Lavon's job, she gets good bonuses. Bonuses, they tax at a higher rate. Like, all these things working against us, so I'm not a fan of taxes. But I pay them because Paul tells me to, not because I want to, not because I feel the need to support the government. I don't, in so many ways. But I do it because Paul tells me to. See, you can love God and dislike the circumstances he places you in. And I got to tell you, if you are going to follow God and you're going to be honest with yourself, it's going to be a common occurrence where you are going to dislike the circumstances you are in. And you can still love God and dislike the circumstances. He may or may not change them. He certainly will not do it on the timeline you want. That I promise you. Paul is writing to Christians in Rome who are being taxed to support an empire that is having public executions in a coliseum of thousands of people cheering. They're in a culture that is just brutal, just wrong. Like I will go and cheer for a football team, and I love it when one of my cornerbacks hits a wide receiver and it's just a solid, good tackle and hit, and I'm excited about it. Yeah, but I don't want either player to die. But Paul is writing to Christians who their sport, they are cheering on the death of the participants. And he's telling those Christians, you have to support through taxes that sport. You have to support the government that is doing that. You have to support this government and respect the authority because God has placed them over you. I don't know if you've noticed what season we're in America. I don't know if you've happened to see a political ad. I know it's early yet. Like you probably haven't gotten a text message yet. Probably haven't seen a commercial. But we're in the middle of an election cycle. And maybe you feel like election cycles never end. So glad we live in a state that has early primaries, right? I want to tell you, the sovereign God works through people we don't vote for. Now, that's not fun to hear. No matter which side, which candidate you vote for, You know who's sovereign? God. And you know what Paul tells us God does? He places those people in office. How many of you guys can say, I'm not going to have you raise your hands, but how many of you guys can say, every single year of my life, I've had the best president ever, and when I don't think it could get any better, the next election cycle, we elect somebody even more amazing. We have been on a winning streak my entire life where every president has been the best. They are going to have to get another mountain because Rushmore's not big enough because they are all so amazing. How many of you guys feel that way? It pains me to say this. It really does. Whoever wins, the sovereign God is still in control, and the sovereign God has placed them as the authority in our life. And we still have to pay our taxes. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't vote or you shouldn't care or you shouldn't pay attention. What it does mean is regardless of who wins, it is our job as a Christian to still support them, to pray for them, to pay our taxes, and to understand that God is still sovereign. Regardless of whatever policies are or aren't happening, God is still sovereign. Regardless of how good or bad it seems like it is, God is still sovereign. And we can dislike whoever sits in the Oval Office, or we can be in love with who sits in the Oval Office. God is still sovereign, and whoever is there, they are only there because God placed them there. That's what Paul tells us. When Paul writes to the Christians in Rome, that is what he says. So go ahead. Pay attention. I encourage you to vote. I encourage you to get behind whatever candidate you want to. I have my opinions. I have strong opinions. But what I know is God is sovereign. And he raises up leaders and he casts leaders aside. And it does us no good to worry about it or get worked up over it. Because ultimately, you know who's still sovereign? God. At the end of the day, you still have to pay your taxes. They may go up, they may go down. Paul didn't put a disclaimer in there. I wish he did. I really wish he did. He didn't. See, the sovereign God is not indebted to our opinions. We all have opinions, right? God pays attention to us. God values time spent when we spend time with God, he values that. He wants us to be with him. He wants us to pray. He wants us to meditate on his word. He wants us to spend time with him. He wants us to share his opinions with him. He wants us to express our concerns with him. Right? That's what prayer is mostly. But he's not indebted to our opinions. He is sovereign and he will do what he does regardless of what your opinion is. Doesn't mean we don't have them or that they don't matter. They just don't matter as much as you think. We all think our opinions are very consequential. I'm here to tell you they're not. Sorry. See, to follow God is to obey him in all things. In all things. Even supporting a government you may not trust or like. Even supporting a government that may mistreat you. Even supporting and respecting the authorities placed over you that you may disagree with. To follow God, we have to obey him in all things. And I wish there was an asterisk. And the fine print would say, unless you strongly disagree with that. Unless you really dislike who's in charge. Unless who's in charge is wrong-headed and stupid. God is sovereign. He can place stupid people in authority. I'm of the opinion sometimes it happens. But Paul tells us to respect them anyway. Paul tells us to pay our taxes and support them anyway. Paul tells us we still have to submit. And so Paul is writing to these Christians who had every reason to not support the government that they were under. If you know anything about Nero, he's going to falsely blame Christians for something, and it's going to start a war, and he's going to scapegoat the Christians and kill a lot of them. Some of them are going to be in the gladiator games. Hooray! Some of them are possibly going to die in the gladiator games that they had to support through their taxes. They were funding their own executions. Talk about circumstances you don't want to be in or dislike. Yet Paul tells them, pay your taxes, submit to the authorities because God is in control and he placed them over you with control. He's sovereign. He's got something bigger in mind. He's got a plan that extends further out than you can imagine. See, God was at work even in the midst of that dark empire. Do you know what else those taxes were doing? When the Roman Christians in the late 50s and early 60s, during the Rome of Nero, when they paid their taxes, you know what else was happening? Rome was building roads. The American interstate system has roughly 46,000 miles of roads. How many of you guys have driven on the interstate? 46,000 miles of interstate. That's a lot. The Roman Empire will build 250,000 miles of roads. Put that slide up. I don't know if you can see, but the red color, the reddish color, those are Roman roads. They would crisscross kind of the known world at the time. They would connect different continents, every major city, the far reaches of the Roman Empire. So when Paul told the Christians to pay their taxes, they did. We assume they did if they were obedient to Paul and God. And I'm sure they did it not willingly, understanding that, but Paul, we're paying taxes to a government that is mistreating us. We're paying taxes to a government that is doing these things. Look, Paul, look at what they're doing. Look at how they're misappropriating funds. Paul, look at how they're spending our money to do things like the gladiator games. Surely God doesn't intend for us to support that with taxes, but Paul still said, respect your authorities, God is sovereign, pay your taxes. What they didn't know is that meanwhile, the Roman Empire was building roads to extend to all of the major cities in the known world. And when Rome would mistreat and persecute Christians, you know what happened? The Christians began to leave Rome. On the roads, their taxes paid for. And so, on the surface at the time, the people didn't understand what was happening, I don't think. But they stayed obedient to God, and God was building his empire through the Roman road system because Rome would become the epicenter for the spread of Christianity. See, Jerusalem may have been where it started. Rome is where it spread from. It was the Roman road system that gave the Roman Christians a way to go and crisscross the known world and spread the gospel faster and wider than they could have ever thought. And it happened because they were obedient to God in situations and circumstances they disliked. They were obedient to God and they had to respect their authorities and pay their taxes. Even though they thought that their authorities, they were right, their authorities were mistreating them, were not doing what they would have hoped. So in difficult situations and circumstances, they were still obedient to God. Meanwhile, God was planning a way to spread his message further and wider than they could have ever thought. But it didn't come because they were going to have to take luxury cruises and casually go about. It came because then God would also have those same rulers and authorities that he placed. They would begin to persecute the Christians, and they would flee for their lives. And along the way, they spread the message. So when we go through difficult seasons, understand God is still sovereign. Understand that his plan is still his plan, and it is working in your life, even in situations we dislike. He is building his kingdom with bricks that we don't like. And that is how Christianity spread. The Roman road system would become, the roads still exist today. It would become the easiest, safest, fastest routes for Christians to move out of Rome and bring with them the message of Jesus. And so the message of the cross spread in a way they could have never imagined because they supported a government they didn't like through the paying of taxes, and those taxes built roads. To follow God is to be obedient in all things. To follow God is to understand there's going to be times and seasons in life we're going to dislike. We're not going to understand. Remain faithful. Keep going to his word. Keep reading and meditating and simply figuring out how to obey it. I dislike the fact that Paul tells me I have to respect authority and pay taxes. But I love the fact that God is sovereign and he can take all of that and turn it into his good. And he does. So the message is this. You may not like where you're currently at in life. Stay faithful. God is still working his plan. We may be in circumstances that hurt. Stay faithful. God has a plan in that. He is good and he is sovereign. He's in control of everything. He has it all figured out. Stay faithful. Let's pray.